We all arrive at leadership with certain preconceptions, but some of those are misconceptions and outright myths. Hey leader, David Burke is here, organizational psychologist and author of 4 best-selling books on helping leaders and teams do their best work ever. And in this episode, we're going to talk about the myths of leadership that are preventing you from being the best leader you can be, that are preventing your team from doing their best work ever. They might even be ruining your team. We all have preconceptions about what it means to be a great leader. We all have ideas about what characteristics leaders are supposed to exhibit. But because we have those stereotypes and we continue to propagate those stereotypes, sometimes that turns into outright myths around what leaders are supposed to be and how they're supposed to lead their team. And some of those myths quite simply aren't true. They may even be destructive. So in this episode, we're going to break down the 6 most common leadership myths and also the truth behind the myth. Let's get started. So the first leadership myth is that your title is your power. This is quite simply not true. Congratulations, you've been promoted into a leadership role, but the mere fact that you are the boss on paper does not actually give you power. Now, in some situations it may. You may have the ability to fire people or the ability to reward them bonuses. If you're watching this and you're a business owner, you might have a little bit more authority, power. But in a lot of modern organizations, unless you're like the senior leader, you don't really have power to get rid of somebody right away, and your team knows that. And even if they did in an economic downturn, in a situation where there's labor shortages, where there's, 2 job openings for every qualified candidate these days, talent knows that they need organizations less than you need them. Moreover, you're not going to get your best work from people if you're just relying on authoritative power to get that from them. And when we look at the research, the forms of power that good leaders really exhibit are either referent power, meaning they like and they've built trust with their people, or expert power, meaning that their people see them as the expert and so they come to them for solutions because they respect their level of expertise. These are the types of power that you're looking to build if you really want to be sustainable as a leader. There may be situations where you have to pull rank and use the power that comes with their title, but they're few and far between compared to the myriad of situations where referent power or expert power are going to serve you better. Building a real sense of connection with your team and building a sense that you have expertise, you have things that you can help them develop and grow into is going to serve you a whole lot further as you look to serve your team. The second common leadership myth is that you need to have all of the answers. And I know this is a little weird because we just talked about expert power and being seen as someone with all the answers. But the truth is, you don't need to have all the answers, and your team knows you don't have all the answers. In fact, they may respect your expertise more when you can demonstrate the limits of your expertise. But I get it. I get why this myth is so common, because presumably you entered into a leadership role because you were a great individual contributor. You had all of the answers as an individual contributor, so we rewarded you for that with a promotion into leadership. But depending on how long you're in leadership, the people doing the work, the individual contributors that you manage, one, they probably know a whole lot more about that subject. They keep up to date with changes about that subject, about that skill set more often than you do. And number 2, you can build a lot of trust with your team by demonstrating, hey, I don't know. I'm committed to helping you find the answer, right? You don't have to have all the answers, but you do have to help people find them. But saying, I don't know, signals a vulnerability that can really help the team build trust because they know that you trust them even with letting down the mask, that you know all the answers. You trust them, you trust their expertise, and your job is to help them find the answers, not just solve all the problems for them. The third myth of leadership is that your leadership style works for everyone. I tend to see this myth most common in sort of middle managers, not frontline leaders for whom one style with the first team they ever led really works. I tend to see it with people 1 or 2 levels up. Usually by the time someone gets into a senior leadership role, they've figured out that what got you here isn't going to get you there. But for a lot of people in the middle, one of the biggest inhibitors of their leadership is they continue to try and be that same style. Whatever the leadership style that's working for you is, you're going to get to the point where you have a big enough and diverse enough team where you realize you're going to need to use different leadership styles with different people. Some people you can just coach. You can say, here's the goal, and I'm here to provide you what you need as you move toward that goal, but I trust you to do your work. And other people you may even have to micromanage, which is never really comfortable unless you're one of the 4% of the population that are psychopaths and you really enjoy this. But you may actually have to micromanage that person until they develop enough competence and enough confidence in their skills to move into that coaching role. Different people in different situations are going to require a little bit different leadership style, and the best leaders have the flexibility to play around with those different styles and find what works best for each individual person. The fourth leadership myth that can really derail your team is that disagreement equals disrespect. Right? That someone on your team speaking up in disagreement with you, challenging your ideas, challenging your plan of action, challenging your sense of priorities, that disagreement is a form of disrespect. You feel like they're challenging you and they're challenging your authority. And that's quite simply not true. The most productive teams, especially teams who have to solve a lot of problems, tap into a lot of creativity, they're going to disagree, right? Everybody comes to the team with different perspectives, different experiences, maybe different training, and that's going to lead them to generate different ideas. And when someone disagrees, they're not saying, I disrespect you. They're saying, I care so much about what we're working on here that I can't help but share my expertise and my perspective. Now, there may be times where people are actually disrespecting you and you need to have that one-on-one conversation, but that's a subject for a different episode. For now, remember that disagreement doesn't equal respect, and how you respond to people disagreeing with you. If you let them feel heard, if you let them play around with making their argument, and you have task-focused disagreement, then you can really grow the level of trust, the level of civility, and the level of idea generation on your team and make them better once you correct this myth. The fifth common leadership myth is that silence equals consent. This is sort of the flip side of the previous myth, right? Disagreement doesn't equal respect, but at the same time, no one saying anything doesn't mean they necessarily agree with you. If you haven't taken the time to build a psychologically safe culture, if you haven't taken the time to build a climate on your team where people disagree respectfully, then most commonly when people disagree, they're just gonna stay silent. They're not going to say anything. Silence on a team usually signals that. Now, it may signal that nobody disagrees, but that's actually even more dangerous. That means everybody thinks alike, in which case lots of people there are unnecessary, right? So what you want is that disagreement. And if there's total silence in a discussion over something, that doesn't necessarily mean consent. It means you have to look for disagreement a little bit harder, and you have to work a little harder to get people to trust you enough to share that disagreement. And the sixth leadership myth is that performance is personal. In other words, individual performance is personal. And this isn't really a leadership myth so much as it's kind of an organizational HR myth. For a lot of legal and other reasons, we've developed this system where we have individual performance reviews and individual incentive compensation and that sort of thing. And that can lead people to think that talent, that performance is just purely individual. But we know from a myriad of research stretching back almost 30 years now, that someone's ability to take their talent is individual, but take that talent and turn it into performance depends on the team they're on, depends on the leader that they have, depends on the resources they have access to. And so there's really two lessons for this. One, your talented people need to be in an environment where they can really unleash that talent. But number two, your people who aren't performing as high as you would like, it's not necessarily an individual issue. In fact, the brilliant researcher, one of the fathers of sort of management and organizational psychology thinking, W. Edwards Deming, had what he called the 85-15 rule. 85% of the time there's a performance issue, it's probably something in the system. It's the team, it's a lack of resources, it's a constraint. And only 15% of the time is it actually an individual's incompetence. Your job as a leader is to identify those 15% of times and help manage that, but more importantly, to identify those 85% of times and what you can do to help change that system to unlock that individual person's performance. Now, this is not a definitive list of all of the different myths and misconceptions about leadership, but these are the 6 most common that I've seen in working with leaders for almost 2 decades now. These are the 6 most common you see when you hear those grandiose stories from charismatic leaders who so often just sort of flame out a couple months later. These are usually the things, the ideas that they kind of promote. And so that's why it's important to correct them all. And you may have even found as you listen to these, there's one you disagree with me on and you think it's not a myth, you think it's actually reality. That's fine, but that might be your signal this is what you're supposed to work on. I don't think it's disrespectful for you to disagree with me, but I would encourage you to keep investigating, keep finding out, is this actually real or is this a misconception I need to work on? And then work on it. And when you do, you'll find the climate on your team changes. You'll find your leadership style changes, and you'll find you've moved your people into a better position where they really can do their best work ever. Oh, and one more thing. This is a list of myths, misconceptions, mistaken beliefs about leadership, but there are some mistaken actions around leaders as well. And so if you're wondering what those are, you're going to want to check out this video here on the mistakes, the most common mistakes that new leaders make that first time they're in a leadership role, or the first time they fail in a leadership role. It's probably because they're making one of these mistakes.